So Dustin, I know that you already have a really amazing pair of binoculars that you invested in about a year or two ago. But I know you also have a spotting scope. So what does a spotting scope give you that your binoculars don't?
Well, the simple answer is reach. A spotting scope is a bigger lens, gets you closer to the bird, but it comes at a high cost. So you really want to use it in sort of like specialized application. That higher magnification is great when you can be still and you want to look for either a bird in a great distance or look at great detail on a bird that's maybe a little bit closer by. But it requires some stability, and they're great for sharing.
Okay. All right. So I kind of get it, but what about the opposite end of the spectrum? When is a spotting scope like completely unnecessary or even like a pain to use?
Well, for certain applications, a spotting scope is sort of too cumbersome to be bothered with, because if you're looking at a little warbler that's moving around a lot, you don't want to be dragging a spotting scope and a tripod, setting it up, the bird moves, set it up, get on it, the bird moves. And it's like heavy and cumbersome, all those sorts of things. So it really depends on the style of birding you're doing at a given time.
I'm laughing because I got this picture in my head the minute you started talking of you like running down a trail in the woods with like this tripod flopping behind you and this big scope out in front
That
of you.
That happens sometimes when there's a good bird off in the distance. But spotting scopes do have a place. They're really great when you're looking at, say, shorebirds off in the distance, that kind of thing.
Okay. All right. So then let's get into some of the nitty gritty then and get much more specific than what we've talked about so far, which has been pretty high level general. What kind of birder actually needs a scope? And then what kind of birder can just skip this as one of the tools in their arsenal?
Well, beginning birders don't worry about a scope whatsoever. But you'll get to a point or to a particular situation where you realize you would like that extra reach. And people with scopes are great about sharing the view that they get with other people. So don't be shy about going in groups and then using someone else's scope now and then to get a sense if that's something that you want for your toolbox. But they're particularly good for shorebird enthusiasts, partly because of habitat, right? The shorebirds are sort of like off in the mud 100 yards away. You might literally not be able to get into that habitat. So they give you the reach to be able to do that. Plus, shorebirds are small. They're often, in the water. Or off, on an island near shore, that kind of thing. So they're really helpful to be able to see that bird or get enough reach that you can actually ID it, where you might not have been able to do that with your binoculars.
So I'm immediately thinking of the Plum Island National Refuge or whatever it's called.
The Parker River, yeah.
There we go.
National Wildlife Refuge.
And we've gone up there at certain times of the year and seen all kinds, like a whole assortment of birds, but they're, to your point, they're off in the distance. They're in that like marshy wetlands area.
Exactly. From, 100 yards away, really difficult or impossible to tell apart, say, a sanderling from a spotted sandpiper or a pectoral sandpiper or a semi-palmated plover, things like that. But they're relatively still. They're moving along a shoreline as sort of a flat horizontal line as opposed to moving back and forth and flying all over the place. They usually fly from spot to spot and give you time to get the scope on it. And like I said, other birders share their scopes all the time. So most birders would never hesitate to ask and say, hey, can I get a look in your scope? Most scope owners would happily share.
Okay, so is it just shorebirds?
No, I mean, waterfowl are great for this too. Sometimes you're looking at a bird way out on the lake on the far distance. Some waterfowl are super skittish. Even if you could get close, they would never let you get close. So they're really good. It can be good for seeing raptors, especially at like hawk watch during migration time when there's large groups of raptors going through the sky, or when it's at a really great distance where you can't even tell enough with the naked eye or with binoculars, but at a great distance you can get a scope on a bird enough to be able to get the ID field marks that you really need to be able to see them. So it can be good for that. We mentioned shorebirds, but also if you are a veteran, being on a pelagic, a boating trip out to sea, that can be good to get a scope on a bird on an island, but it can also be tricky because if the boat's moving and rocking, it kind of can defeat the purpose of using a scope.
No, thank you.
Lynn's turning green just thinking about it.
I totally am.
And lastly, there's a whole style of photography called digiscoping, where someone takes their phone camera and holds it up to the lens on a scope and takes a picture through the scope's glass. It's a little bit tricky, but with a little bit of practice, it's a really easy way to get a decent picture to be able to share with folks on social media without spending a ton on equipment, especially if you're borrowing someone else's scope.
Okay, that's really interesting. I might have some more questions for you on that now that I'm thinking about it. But staying on point with this particular part of the discussion. So those are great examples of who would benefit from a scope. Who are the people who can skip it? You mentioned new birders, but like just in general, like what's your list of people who don't need one?
Yeah, there's a whole skill to being able to set up a scope fast enough to keep it on a bird, particularly if it's moving. So new birders, backyard birders definitely do not need a scope unless they have something really specific and still that they like to keep their eye on, like maybe an owl nest box in the distance or something like that, or a known nest cavity. That could be great. But for the most part, backyard birders skip the scope. Forest and woodland birders, often we're moving to get a better angle, always relocating. The birds in the forest are typically not very stationary. They typically don't need it either. And birders that are there for the sound of it, that really like IDing sound. A scope helps you get a better look at a bird, maybe, but it certainly doesn't help you hear it any better. And anyone who's not like dedicated to birding, if you're a hiker, weight is super important to you. You're not going to want to carry a scope and a tripod and stuff to do that. So it has to be someone who's not just incidentally birding, but who's dedicated to it or knows that there's like a rarity there that they're going to be able to see. Like if there's a flamingo off in the distance, that's a great opportunity to use a scope, but most of us don't get the chance at flamingos or things like that. And then lastly, a scope it's not really a rite of passage or anything like that. It's a tool, and that tool matters to you when it solves a problem. So don't get a scope because you think you need the next big thing. Wait until you're frustrated that you wanted to get a better view and you have an actual problem to solve that a scope can take care of.
I like that. I think that's really practical and insightful advice. Okay, so has your spotting scope ever helped you do something like ID a bird that you would have missed?
Sure, but I just have kind of an entry-level spotting scope. It's not really my typical style of birding. I will set up my scope when there's some birds I know out on the lake, and I can set this up like in our dining room through the front door and get a good look at a bird. I don't usually bring my scope when I'm out birding unless I'm going to sort of a known fixed location, maybe an osprey nest or something like that. But there have definitely been times when we're at Parker River or something and another birder had their scope set up on top of the observation tower. And I was really glad to take a look and help me get an ID or look at a lifer that I hadn't seen before.
I want to go back to something that you mentioned right at the start because it sounded really interesting to me. And I don't know, maybe this is how you're going to get me to stand still in the woods. But okay, so using a spotting scope for photography, like what is that all about?
Well, it's kind of what you think, right? Almost everybody has a phone in their pocket, and that's your go-to camera. Most people do not have a fancy telephoto zoom lens that might cost several $1,000s with a fancy DSLR or mirrorless camera, but you do have that camera in your pocket all the time. The best camera is the one you have with you. And the way to get that camera onto a bird in the distance is to get it through some glass. And there's some birders that even like to take their binoculars and digiscope right through their binoculars. So it is totally possible to hold your camera up just right. It takes a little practice, but to be able to digiscope, it's called, directly through your binoculars or directly through the scope for the best picture. And the scope is usually easier to do it than your camera, because when you're holding your phone and your camera, both things are moving. When you have a scope, usually it's on the tripod, so you just have to move your camera. And there are manufacturers that make dedicated mounts that allow you to clip your phone right onto the eyepiece of the scope so you can get the picture that you want.
So digiscoping is mainly done with a mobile phone camera. You wouldn't do that with like your DSLR.
Definitely not with a big DSLR. I mean, I have a lens to do that. I guess theoretically, if you had a point and shoot or a small portrait style camera, you could do it the same as with your phone, but most people aren't carrying both a phone and a basic point and shoot.
I think that's really, really cool. Do you think there's people that forego having like involved camera setups because they just go this way instead?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's tons of birders that prefer that because they might have been going to bring both of those things along anyway, and they don't want to bring another piece of equipment just to take pictures. Yeah, and there's some really good birders out there. There's a birder that goes by the handle The Bird Chick. Her name is Sharon Steitler, and she gives bird tours essentially focused on digiscoping, like just to teach people how to do that and get good at it.
That's really
it's
fun.
a technique. It requires a little bit of practice, but you can get really good at it without too much, time investment.
All right. Well, maybe our audience wants to check out her. So yeah, that's really, really cool. Okay. So let's say someone decides watching this, you know what? All of these criteria kind of fit my needs and what I want to do next. Like, what should they think about when it comes to buying a scope and spending that money? What are some of the general things people need to keep in mind?
Well, with any optics, the first thing is to settle into your budget and understand what you are willing to spend for the tool that you're buying. Entry-level scopes start at maybe $200-$300, but go up to $2,000-$3,000 to a really nice Swarovski scope.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And so it's important to kind of go into it knowing what you want to spend, but they all have pretty good glass, right? The difference between an entry-level scope and a really advanced scope is the amount of light and the clarity that gets on the bird, but you're looking at the same bird through both pieces of glass, and especially like beginner, even intermediate birders probably can't even appreciate the difference between a low level and a high level scope, except for in low light situation. That's the one place. So if you are often birding, at dusk and at dawn, that kind of thing, the extra expense might make up for it. But if you're a, typical full daylight birder like most of us, I would say you do not need to spend a lot of money on a scope, that's for sure. Next up is you have to think about the weight that you're carrying around. So in entry level scopes, I feel a little bit heavier, but I'm usually pretty able-bodied, not a big deal to put an extra 5 pounds in my pack or bring something extra. But it also requires a tripod because you can't just hold a scope by hand. You're moving around too much, right?
Yeah, that would be awkward.
So you need a tripod, a good heavy-duty one. The tripod I use is a medium to high end, but not super high end. Mine is aluminum, but some come in carbon fiber, stuff like that. The legs on mine lock with a twist action, which is a little bit stronger than some of the flip ones. But it can be a little more time consuming when you have to make an adjustment. Yep. And the attachment point is a big deal. I use just kind of a fixed plate on this ball head, but this is really like a medium level sort of attachment. It doesn't move super smoothly. So that's one of the areas where I could improve my gear a little bit would be with another more floating head or a gimbal that allows you to move the scope around. But I tend to use my tripod for my camera on a fixed thing rather than on a scope. So for me, I prioritize a tripod that works best for my camera. It happens to work for my scope, but I don't prioritize scope use on it.
Okay, so I think this was a really interesting overview. Anything else that you want to cover before we close out this segment?
No, I'd just be curious if our listeners or watchers have been birding with just binoculars. Have you ever thought about adding a scope? Or if you already use one, what finally pushed you over the edge to get one? Let us know in the comments. We're always interested to hear how other people have evolved their setups based on how and where they bird.